Well, hello again. This is another yes or no question about a pretty colorful character, Fidel Castro. Wow. Uh, and of course, the question is, was Castro good for Cuba? Well, Castro was the son of a fairly well off Cuban farmer out in the eastern end of the Oriente province of Cuba. And As a student, he quickly took on kind of revolutionary anti establishment views. And At a fairly early age 27, along with his brother Raul and the legendary Che Guevara, initiated a revolutionary war in Cuba against the, as he saw it, corrupt regime of Fulgencio Batista. That war went on for 6 years, and Castro finally prevailed in 1959 and threw out the old regime and took over and set up a Marxist communist state in Cuba. Incidentally, just a brief word about Che Guevara. His real name was Ernesto. Che was just an Argentine nickname that the Cubans gave him. And he was from an Argentine, pretty good Argentine family. He was a medical doctor. He traveled around trying to give medical relief to people who weren't so well off in different places, and quickly decided that revolutionary behavior was in order because of all the bad stuff that he saw. And so he was a key part of the first few years of the regime in Cuba. He was with Castro for about 6 years, and then I guess he got bored and went off and tried to stir up some revolutions elsewhere. And finally, in one in Bolivia, he was shot dead, killed, age 39. So that was the end of Che Guevara, but a legendary character. Anyway, getting back to Fidel, he of course had a historic, long, and world famous regime in Cuba. There was at one time an effort to oust him, an American-backed queue of Cuban exiles. Many Cubans had left Cuba and gone to Miami. They basically run Miami now. And the CIA managed this attempted coup in the Bay of Pigs incident under President Kennedy. A disaster. For some reason or other, it didn't come off, and it made the Americans and the exiles look pretty foolish. And it is also a rumor that the CIA also tried to kill Castro with an exploding cigar. It might be true. Nothing would surprise me, but maybe that wasn't true. But it's a good story anyway. The Cuban economy under Castro was not a robust, self-financing one, but as a darling communist poster boy in the Western Hemisphere, attracted the support of the Soviet Union, particularly Nikita Khrushchev, and so the Soviets continued to bail out Cuba financially, and they were finally persuaded by the Soviets to actually install medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, somewhat in response to the Americans having positioned nuclear missiles, I think it was in Turkey or something, which the Soviet Union understandably saw as a threat, so they were simply countering that. And there was a big standoff, as you probably know. Incidentally, I was on a ship anchored off the coast of Cuba, the Navy, when all this was happening. I didn't quite realize quite how serious the situation was, actually, but many people say the world came close to, all-out war in those days. I'm not so sure, but anyway, the thing was defused. The Russians took the missiles back. And Castro continued again with great difficulty. He lost a lot of the most talented people. He ran a pretty tough regime, locking up political opponents, rumors of torture, and so forth. The economy really didn't do very well, and as he got older, it seems like he got more irrelevant. Used to give these speeches to exhort his followers that would go on sometimes 4, 5, and 6 hours, which sounds kind of manic itself. And eventually, in 2008, his health was failing, so he handed over power to his brother Raul, who is still the boss in Cuba today, and Castro died in 2016. So that's kind of Castro's bullet point history. And a lot of people on the left end of the spectrum view him as a great hero and someone who did a lot for the Cuban people. He was represented a real exemplar of communist, socialist, Marxist philosophy and action, etc., etc. And others, of course, more to the right end of the spectrum, disagree and view the capitalist expropriations and the stifling of dissent and so forth as typical of that kind of rabid left-wing dictator. So you have the different views. Okay, well, let's start examining them. Let's talk about, first of all, those who say, yes, he was good for Cuba. Well, much, of course, of the support for Castro comes from the notion that he was doing his best to set up an anti-corruption, anti-establishment, anti-capitalist community and form of government in Cuba. He had, some would say, the best of intentions. He was there to look after the people. And in the process of doing that, he certainly improved their medical care. There's some question about how fairly that care was distributed in Cuba, but nonetheless, he made significant improvements. He also improved the literacy rate in Cuba, which is quite a commendable thing to have done. And so he did a lot for the citizens of Cuba, and it was accepted as such. Not only was Castro's regime seen to be a major exemplar, again, of what a socialist government can do for its people, but it was also seen as a response to what was clearly a fairly corrupt regime under General Batista, who himself had come to power in Cuba from a military coup. And in those days, under Batista, the mafia, the American mafia, seemed to run the vice and tourism business in old Havana. And so Cuba basically had three industries. It had tobacco, sugar, and vice and tourism. And under Castro, it only had the first two. And so that was seen to be, a step forward, a step in the right direction toward making it a decent place. And finally, perhaps most important of all, much of his support from his electorate, from the citizens, maybe electorate is too strong a word, but anyway, from the citizens of Cuba, came from the notion that he was standing up to the American bully. The Americans had long dominated Cuba, had in many respects pushed it around, restricted what it could do. During the Castro regime, of course, there were trade embargoes. One of the reasons the cars broke down is they couldn't get any spare parts from America because it was illegal to send them anything, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of standing up to the American bully played very well in the provinces. And for that he had great support, and some would say did the nation a great service. So, those are the kinds of qualities and behavior and initiatives and so forth that people cite when they talk about how Castro is actually pretty good for Cuba. So, what are some of the negatives? What do some of the people say that he really didn't do a very good job? I suppose the two biggest are these. Number one, he pretty much wrecked the economy. And because it was a sort of a dirigiste, top-down, centrally planned economy, in the long run, those things never work. They certainly didn't work in the Soviet Union, and so the country was really not self-sustaining. And so when the Soviet Union finally broke up and was no longer inclined to subsidize the failures of the Cuban economy, they really were in trouble and have kind of lurched from financial and economic crisis from time to time to the next. So that was certainly a major criticism, and for the people, many of them were surprisingly more impoverished than it was generally known in the rest of the world. And second, he was an oppressive, authoritarian dictator. There was no freedom of speech. The dissidents and people who spoke out were jailed, sometimes for a long time. It was a scary place to be if you were anything other than a fidelista. So anyway, the opposition to Castro it basically had to be underground and just wasn't permitted. Next, as part of his kind of implied deal with the Soviet Union, he became an army proxy for the Soviet Union in other places and in Africa, for instance. In Angola, as an example, there were as many as 50,000 Cuban troops in Angola trying to subvert the existing government and aiding the revolutionary forces there. Again, doing the bidding of the Soviet Union, but in a way that certainly cost the Cuban nation dear. Some 10,000 Cuban soldiers were killed in Angola, and they were up to this kind of thing elsewhere in Africa along the way. Something which I suppose you might think that was part of the bargain with the Soviet Union, but it certainly wasn't good for the nation. Next, the much vaunted medical care that Castro provided might not have been what it was represented to be. Of course, medical care was improved, but the good medical care seems to have been restricted to, the elite, those in power, kind of people at the top of the pyramid, and the poor got a lot less than they might have hoped under a system that was supposedly rapidly improving its medical care. But nonetheless, it was better than it had been. As a part of the deal to get financial support from the Soviet Union, of course, they were a kind of a proxy for the Soviet Union in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, this led to the importation of the medium-range ballistic nuclear-tipped missiles to Cuba, which turned out to really be a big mistake on Castro's part, because not only did he have to back off, the Russians took the missiles back, but that hardened the mentality and the opposition from America, especially from the Cuban Americans in Miami, ever greater. So that, with hindsight, was a big mistake to make, and a very provocative one too, because of course he was courting with real danger here. As an armed revolutionary, he probably thought this was all in a day's work, but it was, with hindsight, a pretty bloody stupid thing to do. And finally, at the time of the revolution, so this was in 1959 and the years following, he drove out much of the talent from the country. Many of the most educated people, the wealthiest people, the successful businessmen, the landowners, decamped to Miami, a city which is, I think think I may have mentioned before, Cubans basically run. And they do a good job. I mean, they're very capable people, and he lost an awful lot of those, and so that definitely was not good for Cuba. Okay, well, that's the bill of particulars against Fidel, and there are quite a few of them, and one can see why there are quite a few people who don't think he was good for Cuba. Well, what's my take on all of this? I guess, once again, I have to look at this recurring phenomenon of how, in so many of the examples I've treated in this video series, we encounter a revolutionary, someone who comes in the heels of a coup d'etat, where there has been an inept or corrupt regime preceding them, comes in and takes over in an authoritarian, oppressive way, and does this with the kind of underlying assumption that the ends justify the means. You have to be tough in order to straighten things out, and then, of course, make the mistake perhaps of staying tough and continuing to oppress and continuing to lock people up who don't like what you're doing and so forth. And so at the end of the day, as you're evaluating regimes like this, what you're really doing is kind of balancing what the people have to put up with the situation in the nation and how well off the citizens are, and in particular in comparison to what they might have been under other regimes. In this respect, I have to say, I don't care much for what Fidel did in Cuba. I do know that he brought about improvement. I do know his predecessor was corrupt, but he made a mess of the place. And he certainly was not a very wise man by getting himself involved in that missile business with the U.S. and with the Soviets. But I would say that, wouldn't I? Perhaps I'm biased, but no, I don't think so. I think it wasn't worth it, and the Cubans are worse off for having had him. Okay, well, there you go. Like it or not, if you do, give me a like, please, subscribe, the usual thing, give me a notification, ideas, comments, and so forth. And I will see you at the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.